Congratulations, Mr. Hargrove, you're in perfect health. 6 words that would trigger the most devastating family experiment in billionaire history. But the 72-year-old tech mogul had no idea he was about to discover something more terminal than any disease could ever be. When Elliot Hargrove fakes a deadly illness to test his 3 children's true feelings, the results will shatter everything he believed about family, love, and legacy. Watch as his lawyer son immediately asks about power of attorney instead of offering comfort. His socialite daughter turns his death sentence into viral social media content, while hidden cameras capture them, calling him a walking bank account with a deadline behind his back. But when the shocking will reading reveals he's leaving 90% of his fortune to charity, the explosive family meltdown exposes greed so raw it will leave you speechless. This isn't just about one man's test of his children's love, it's about the moment when a father discovered that only one of his kids saw him as a person rather than a paycheck, and how that revelation would redefine everything about wealth, worth, and what it truly means to leave a legacy. Stay until the end to see how fake death became real redemption. Congratulations, Mr. Hargrove. You're in perfect health. Those 6 words would trigger the most devastating family experiment in billionaire history. But the man sitting in that pristine medical office had no idea he was about to discover something more terminal than any disease: the truth about the people who claimed to love him. What happened next will shock you. But first, let me tell you about Elliot Hargrove and why this routine doctor's visit was about to become the beginning of the most heartbreaking test a father could ever conduct. Dr. Patricia Chen closed the medical file with the satisfaction of someone delivering genuinely good news to a patient who could afford the best healthcare money could buy. At 72, Elliot Hargrove possessed the physical vitality of a man 20 years younger, his cardiovascular system strengthened by decades of competitive sailing, his mind sharp as the day he'd revolutionized cloud computing technology, and his overall health profile that of someone who had invested as wisely in his body as he had in his business empire. The irony wasn't lost on Elliot as he sat in the leather chair of Manhattan's most exclusive medical practice, surrounded by technology that cost more than most people's homes. He'd built his fortune by solving problems that others couldn't see, by anticipating needs before they became critical, and by understanding human nature well enough to predict market behaviors with uncanny accuracy. But the one problem he couldn't solve with algorithms or acquisitions was the growing suspicion that his own children saw him not as a father, but as a financial opportunity with a countdown timer. Elliot Hargrove hadn't always been cynical about family loyalty. 3 decades earlier, when he'd first started Hargrove Technologies in a cramped garage, his children had been young enough to see him as simply Dad, the man who helped with homework, attended soccer games, and read bedtime stories between coding sessions that would eventually change the world. But success had a way of transforming relationships, and as his net worth climbed into the billions, he'd watched his children's interactions with him become increasingly transactional. Julian, his eldest at 45, had become a corporate lawyer whose conversations with his father inevitably steered toward estate planning and tax optimization strategies. Vanessa, 42, lived a life of carefully curated luxury that required constant financial infusions to maintain her social media presence and charity board positions. And Leo, the youngest at 38, had chosen the path of artistic rebellion, rejecting the family business but somehow still dependent on the trust fund that allowed him to pursue his passion for sculpture without concern for commercial viability. The problem wasn't that his children needed financial support. Elliot had always planned to share his wealth with them. The problem was the growing sense that their love had become conditional on his continued ability to provide that support. Phone calls came only when they needed something. Family gatherings felt like board meetings where the agenda was always about money. Even their expressions of concern for his health seemed motivated more by inheritance anxiety than genuine care for his well-being. Sitting in Dr. Chen's office, receiving confirmation that he could live another 20 healthy years, Elliot felt a profound loneliness that no amount of wealth could cure. He'd built an empire that employed thousands, created technologies that improved millions of lives, and accumulated resources that could fund entire universities. But he couldn't buy the one thing he wanted most, the certainty that his own children would mourn the man rather than celebrate the windfall when he was gone. That's when the idea struck him with the clarity of a brilliant business insight. If he wanted to know his children's true feelings about his mortality, he needed to create a situation where they believed his mortality was imminent. Not a real terminal diagnosis that would be too cruel to everyone involved, but a carefully constructed test that would reveal their authentic reactions to the prospect of losing him. The plan began forming in his mind with the same strategic precision that had made him one of the world's most successful entrepreneurs. He would fake a terminal illness, observe how each child responded, and finally learn whether any of them truly loved the father behind the fortune. If you've ever wondered whether the people closest to you love you for who you are, or what you can provide, hit that like button and let me know in the comments what you think Elliot will discover about his family. This story is about to unfold the most painful truth any parent could face. And trust me, you won't want to miss what happens when money meets mortality. Subscribe because stories about family, love, and the price of wealth touch all of our hearts. Right at that moment, Elliot knew he had to put his devastating plan into motion. But what happened during that seemingly innocent family brunch would shatter every illusion he'd held about the people he'd raised and loved. What unfolded next would prove that money doesn't just corrupt relationships, it reveals the corruption that was always hiding beneath the surface. The Hargrove estate's dining room gleamed with the understated elegance of old money, where crystal chandeliers cast warm light over a mahogany table that had hosted decades of family celebrations. This particular Sunday brunch had been carefully orchestrated by Elliot, who had asked Martha, his trusted housekeeper of 20 years, to prepare all of his children's favorite dishes while keeping his secret safe. Martha Rodriguez had been more than an employee, she'd been a confidant, a surrogate mother to the children when business had pulled Elliot away, and the one person in the household who had watched the family dynamics deteriorate with genuine sadness. When Elliot had confided his plan to her, she'd initially protested, worried about the emotional damage such a deception might cause. But she'd also seen how his children treated him, and she understood his desperate need to know the truth. Julian arrived first, his perfectly tailored suit and polished demeanor reflecting the corporate lawyer he'd become. At 45, he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never doubted his place in the world or his eventual inheritance. Vanessa swept in 15 minutes later, her designer dress and professional makeup suggesting she'd already planned the Instagram posts that would document this family gathering. Leo appeared last, his paint-stained jeans and rumpled shirt a deliberate contrast to his siblings' polished appearances. As the family settled around the table, sharing small talk about weather and weekend plans, Elliot felt his heart pounding with the weight of what he was about to do. He'd rehearsed this moment countless times, but facing his children now, he almost lost his nerve. Then he remembered the last Christmas gathering, where Julian had spent most of dinner on his phone discussing merger strategies, and Vanessa had live-streamed their gift exchange for her social media followers. "I have something important to share with all of you," Elliot began, his voice carrying the tremor of genuine emotion despite the fabricated nature of his announcement. "I received some difficult news from my doctor this week." The change in the room's atmosphere was immediate and telling. Julian's fork paused halfway to his mouth, his lawyer's instincts immediately assessing the implications. Vanessa's phone, which had been discreetly positioned for a food photo, suddenly commanded her full attention as she sensed a more dramatic story developing. Only Leo looked directly at his father with what appeared to be genuine concern. The tests revealed a rare and aggressive condition. Elliot continued, his voice breaking in a way that surprised even him with its authenticity. "The specialists are telling me I have approximately 6 months to live." The silence that followed was deafening, but the reaction spoke volumes. Julian's first words weren't about comfort or support. They were about logistics. Dad, have you spoken with the estate planning team about updating your power of attorney documentation? Vanessa's response was equally revealing. Her eyes immediately filled with tears, but her hands moved instinctively to her phone, already calculating how this family tragedy could be transformed into social media content that would generate sympathy and engagement. Leo's reaction was differential, immediate, and completely unfiltered. "Are you serious right now?" he demanded, his voice rising with genuine anguish. "You're telling us you're dying, and Julian's talking about paperwork?" The test had begun, and already the results were more devastating than Elliot had imagined. But the tragedy had not stopped yet. What happened in the hours following Elliot's devastating announcement would prove that grief reveals character in ways that comfort never could, and his children's true natures were about to emerge with shocking clarity. Within 30 minutes of the brunch ending, Julian had cornered Elliot's longtime attorney, Marcus Webb, in the estate's library. The conversation that Martha overheard while serving coffee was chilling in its calculated coldness. "Marcus, we need to discuss Dad's power of attorney arrangements immediately," Julian said, his voice carrying the urgent tone of someone closing a business deal rather than processing a father's terminal diagnosis. "Given his condition, I should probably take over financial decision-making sooner rather than later to ensure the company's stability." The speed with which Julian had shifted from son to successor was breathtaking. He wasn't asking about treatment options, second opinions, or ways to make his father more comfortable. He was positioning himself to control a multi-billion-dollar empire before Elliot was even in the ground. Meanwhile, Vanessa had retreated to her childhood bedroom, but not for the private mourning one might expect. Instead, she was staging an elaborate social media production, complete with strategically placed tissues and carefully applied makeup that suggested tears without actually ruining her appearance. Her Instagram story, posted just 2 hours after learning of her father's diagnosis, showed her in a designer black dress with the caption, "Life is so fragile. Cherish every moment with the people you love, AUG number, family number, blessed number, grateful." The post garnered hundreds of sympathetic comments and thousands of likes within minutes, transforming her father's terminal illness into social media currency. But what made it even more disturbing was the follow-up story she posted from a luxury spa, announcing she was taking time to process this devastating news at a 5-star wellness retreat that cost more per night than most people's monthly salary. Leo's reaction was the polar opposite of his siblings' calculated responses. He stormed back into the dining room where Elliot still sat, his face flushed with an anger that had been building for decades. "You want to know what's killing me about this?" Leo demanded, his voice breaking with genuine emotion. "It's not that you're dying, Dad. It's that you've been emotionally dead to this family for years." The confrontation that followed was raw and devastating. Leo didn't ask about inheritance or power of attorney. Instead, he unleashed years of pent-up frustration about having an absent father who had been physically present but emotionally unavailable. "You missed every art show, every gallery opening, every moment that mattered to me because you were too busy building your empire," Leo continued, tears streaming down his face. "And now that you're finally vulnerable, Julian's already dividing up your assets and Vanessa's turning your death into content." What shocked Elliot most was that Leo's anger wasn't about money, it was about love. While his other children were calculating their inheritance, Leo was mourning the relationship they'd never had and the time they'd never get back. For the first time in the conversation, Leo's voice softened. "I don't want your money, Dad, I never did. I just wanted you to see me as your son, not as a disappointment who didn't follow the family business plan." The contrast was devastating. Julian saw dollar signs, Vanessa saw social media opportunities, but Leo saw a father he'd always loved but never felt loved by in return. The test was revealing truths that cut deeper than any terminal diagnosis ever could. Elliot sat in stunned silence, realizing that his experiment was uncovering not just his children's greed, but his own failures as a father. No one expected what happened next, but when Elliot announced he was updating his will due to his deteriorating condition, the mask of family concern finally slipped completely off, revealing the ugly truth about what his children really cared about. What unfolded over the following weeks would prove that nothing brings out people's true character quite like the prospect of a massive inheritance. Elliot had begun using a wheelchair and adopting the frail demeanor of someone whose time was running out. The performance was Oscar-worthy, complete with trembling hands and a deliberately weakened voice that suggested his illness was progressing rapidly. Martha played her part perfectly, fussing over his medication schedule and speaking in the hushed tones of someone caring for a dying man. The transformation in Julian and Vanessa's behavior was immediate and stunning. Julian, who had visited the estate maybe 3 times in the previous year, suddenly became a daily presence, arriving each morning with coffee and pastries as if he'd always been the devoted son. His conversations with Elliot were peppered with carefully scripted expressions of love and concern, but Martha noticed how his eyes constantly scanned the room, taking inventory of valuable artwork and antiques with the calculating gaze of an appraiser. "Dad, I've been thinking about our family legacy," Julian said during one of his manufactured bonding sessions, his voice dripping with false sentimentality. "I want to make sure that everything you've built continues to honor your vision after, well, when the time comes." The subtext was clear. He was positioning himself as the rightful heir to not just the money, but the moral authority to make decisions about the Hargrove empire. Vanessa's approach was even more theatrical. She began bringing professional photographers to the estate, claiming she wanted to capture precious family memories while her father was still alive. But the carefully staged photos, Vanessa reading to her ailing father, Vanessa holding his hand while gazing soulfully into the distance, Vanessa arranging flowers in his room were clearly designed for future use in interviews and social media posts about her close relationship with her late father. "Daddy, I want you to know how much these moments mean to me." She would coo while the cameras clicked, her words carefully chosen for maximum emotional impact when they would inevitably be quoted in magazine articles about grieving heiresses. She'd even hired a documentary crew to follow her around, ostensibly to create a tribute film, but obviously intending to position herself as the loving daughter who'd been by his side during his final months. But the most disturbing development was what Elliot discovered through the hidden microphones he'd installed throughout the house. Late one evening, Julian and Vanessa met in the estate's wine cellar, believing they were safely out of earshot from their dying father. "We need to discuss the Leo problem," Julian said, his voice carrying none of the warmth he displayed during his public interactions with Elliot. "Dad's always had a soft spot for the artistic black sheep routine, and I'm worried he might leave Leo a significant portion of the estate out of some misguided sense of guilt." Vanessa's response was even more chilling. "Leo's always been a waste of space, but now he's a threat to our financial security. We need to make sure Dad understands that leaving money to someone with no business sense is essentially throwing it away." The conversation that followed revealed the depth of their conspiracy. They discussed hiring additional estate planning attorneys, possibly challenging Leo's mental competency if necessary, and even exploring ways to have him declared unfit to inherit due to his unstable artistic lifestyle. They spoke about their brother not as family, but as an obstacle to be managed or eliminated. "The truth is," Julian said with casual cruelty, "Leo never really understood what it means to be a Hargrove. He rejected everything Dad built, so why should he benefit from it? We're the ones who've been supporting the family name and maintaining the relationships that matter." Vanessa agreed enthusiastically. "Exactly. We've been the responsible ones, the ones who've honored Dad's legacy. Leo chose to be an outsider, so he should live with the consequences of that choice." Meanwhile, Leo continued to visit his father regularly, but his interactions remained refreshingly genuine. He didn't bring cameras or stage heartfelt moments. Instead, he simply sat with Elliot, sometimes in comfortable silence, sometimes sharing stories about his art or asking about his father's early struggles building the company. Leo was the only one who seemed interested in Elliot as a person rather than as a source of inheritance. During one particularly moving conversation, Leo had said, "Dad, I know we've had our differences, but I want you to know that I'm proud of what you accomplished. I may not have wanted to follow in your footsteps, but I've always respected the fact that you built something meaningful from nothing." The contrast was devastating. While Julian and Vanessa plotted to eliminate Leo from their father's will, Leo was expressing genuine love and admiration for the man Elliot had been, not just the fortune he'd accumulated. Listening to these recordings in the privacy of his study, Elliot felt his heart breaking in ways that no terminal illness could have caused. The test was revealing truths that would change his family forever. If you've ever questioned whether people love you for who you are, or what you can give them, hit that like button and share your thoughts in the comments about what you think Elliot should do next. This family experiment is about to reach its explosive climax, and the revelations that follow will redefine everything about love, loyalty, and the true cost of wealth. Subscribe because stories about family betrayal and unexpected grace remind us what really matters in life. Right at that moment, Elliot decided to expand his surveillance network throughout the estate. But what he captured over the following weeks would shatter every remaining illusion about his children's character. What he discovered would prove that when people think they're unobserved, they reveal truths so devastating that no amount of wealth could ever repair the damage. The hidden cameras and microphones that Elliot installed with Martha's help captured conversations that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The technology was state-of-the-art, virtually undetectable, and positioned in every room where his children might speak freely when they believed their dying father couldn't hear them. The first devastating recording came from Julian's phone conversation with his business partner while he stood in Elliot's study, surrounded by family photos and awards that documented decades of achievement. Julian's voice carried none of the respect or grief one might expect from a son discussing his father's impending death. "Listen, the old man's got maybe 4 months left. 5 at the outside," Julian said, casually leaning against the desk where Elliot had built his empire. "The moment he's gone, we're liquidating the entire tech division. The market's hot right now, and I've already got 3 buyers lined up who are willing to pay premium prices for the patents and intellectual property." The callousness was breathtaking. Julian wasn't just planning to sell his father's life's work, he was eager to do it, treating decades of innovation and thousands of employees' livelihoods as nothing more than assets to be converted into cash as quickly as possible. But Julian wasn't finished. "Honestly, it'll be a relief when this is over," he continued, his voice taking on an almost gleeful tone. "No more pretending to care about his environmental initiatives or his charitable foundations. We can finally run this empire like a real business instead of his personal feel-good project." The recordings from Vanessa were equally crushing. During a lunch with her socialite friends at the estate's poolside terrace, she spoke about her father's condition with stunning cruelty, apparently forgetting that sound carries easily across water. "The whole dying billionaire thing is actually working out perfectly for my brand." Vanessa laughed, her voice carrying clearly to the hidden microphones. "The sympathy content is getting incredible engagement, and I've already been approached by 3 networks about doing a documentary on grieving publicly. There's definitely a book deal in this somewhere." Her friends gasped at the calculated nature of her comments, but Vanessa continued without shame. "I mean, it's sad that Daddy's dying, obviously, but let's be realistic. He's 72 and had a good run. At least his death is going to be profitable for those of us left behind." The most devastating recording came when Vanessa and Julian met privately in the estate's library, believing Elliot was napping upstairs. Their conversation revealed a level of greed and callousness that shocked even Elliot, who had expected selfishness but not outright cruelty. "I'm worried Dad's getting sentimental in his final days." Vanessa said, her voice carrying the concern of someone protecting a business interest rather than honoring a father's wishes. Yesterday, he mentioned wanting to increase the charitable donations in his will. We can't let emotion cloud his judgment when there are practical considerations to think about. Julian's response was even more chilling. We need to be strategic about this. If he starts giving away too much to charity, there won't be enough left for the family. I've been researching ways to challenge charitable bequests on the grounds of diminished capacity due to terminal illness. But it was Julian's next comment that delivered the killing blow to any remaining father-son bond. Honestly, at this point, Dad's just a walking bank account with a deadline, he said with casual cruelty. The sooner we can get past the emotional theatrics and focus on asset preservation, the better off everyone will be. The phrase hit Elliot like a physical blow. A walking bank account with a deadline. That's how his eldest son, the child he'd raised, educated, and given every advantage, truly saw him. Not as a father, not as a human being, but as a financial resource whose only remaining value was the wealth he would leave behind. Even more heartbreaking was overhearing Vanessa's response. God, I can't wait for this to be over. Having to pretend to be the grieving daughter is exhausting. The crying on cue, the heartfelt social media posts, the constant performance of caring, it's like being in the world's most depressing play. The recordings revealed conversation after conversation of similar callousness. Julian discussing which staff members to fire immediately after the funeral to streamline operations. Vanessa planning a lavish European vacation for immediately after the will reading, calling it her grief recovery tour. Both siblings casually dismissing Leo as the family disappointment who didn't deserve any significant inheritance. But perhaps most devastating was discovering that they had been discussing their father's death, as if it were an inevitable business transaction rather than the loss of someone they claimed to love. They spoke about funeral arrangements in terms of networking opportunities, about memorial services as chances to connect with other wealthy families, and about their inheritance as compensation for having to endure the burden of being Elliot Hargrove's children. Sitting alone in his study, reviewing hours of recordings that documented his children's true feelings, Elliot felt a profound grief that no terminal diagnosis could have caused. The test had been successful. He now knew exactly how his children felt about him. The knowledge was more devastating than any disease could ever be. The man who had built an empire worth billions had discovered that he was poverty-stricken in the only currency that truly mattered, a genuine love from his own family. But the most powerful moment was yet to come. What happened when Elliot finally decided to confess the truth to Leo would prove that sometimes the greatest revelations occur not through deception, but through the courage to be vulnerable with the one person who might actually understand. 3 weeks after installing the surveillance system, Elliot could no longer bear the weight of what he'd discovered about Julian and Vanessa. The recordings had painted a picture of greed and callousness so complete that he felt physically sick every time he looked at his 2 eldest children. But Leo's consistent visits, his genuine concern, and his refusal to discuss inheritance or business matters had created a stark contrast that Elliot could no longer ignore. On a quiet Thursday evening, as autumn rain drummed against the estate's windows, Elliot made a decision that would change everything. Leo had come by after his art class, bringing Chinese takeout and settling into the chair beside his father's wheelchair, with the comfortable ease of someone who wasn't performing for an audience. "Leo," Elliot began, his voice carrying a tremor that for once wasn't manufactured. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to promise me you'll listen to everything before you react." Leo looked up from his lo mein, immediately sensing the gravity in his father's tone. "Dad, you're scaring me. Is the illness progressing faster than the doctors thought?" Elliot took a deep breath, steeling himself for a confession that would either destroy their relationship forever or finally create the authentic connection he'd always craved with his youngest son. "Leo, I'm not dying. I'm not sick at all. the terminal diagnosis, the wheelchair. All of it's been a lie. The silence that followed was deafening. Leo's chopsticks clattered to the floor as he stared at his father in shock, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and dawning understanding. Elliot had prepared for anger, for accusations, for Leo to storm out and never speak to him again. Instead, what he saw in Leo's eyes was something unexpected relief. "You're not dying?" Leo whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. "Dad, you're really not dying?" "I'm perfectly healthy," Elliot confirmed, watching his son's face carefully. "The whole thing was a test. I wanted to see how you and your siblings would react if you thought I only had months to live. I needed to know if any of you loved me for who I am, or just for what I could give you." Leo slumped back in his chair, running his hands through his hair as the full implications sank in. "A test," he repeated slowly. "You put us through a test about whether we love you." Elliot braced himself for the explosion of anger he was certain would follow, but Leo's response surprised him completely. "Thank God," Leo said, his voice filled with genuine relief rather than rage. "Dad, do you have any idea what these past few weeks have been like for me? I've been lying awake every night thinking about all the conversations we never had, all the time we wasted, all the things I never got to say to you." The reaction was so different from what Elliot had expected that he found himself speechless. Where he'd anticipated fury over the deception, he found gratitude for the reprieve. Where he'd expected accusations about manipulation, he found relief about restored possibilities. "I don't care about your money, Dad," Leo continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I never did. When you told us you were dying, my first thought wasn't about inheritance or wills or any of that crap. My first thought was that I was going to lose you before we ever really knew each other." The honesty in Leo's voice was devastating in its simplicity. While Julian and Vanessa had immediately calculated financial implications, Leo had mourned the loss of relationship potential. While his siblings had seen opportunity, Leo had seen tragedy. "You want to know what kills me?" Leo said, leaning forward with an intensity that reminded Elliot of his own younger self. "It's not that you tested us. It's that you felt like you had to. What kind of family have we become that you couldn't trust us to love you without conditions?" The question cut straight to the heart of Elliot's deepest fears and regrets. "Leo, I've been a terrible father," he admitted, his voice breaking with decades of suppressed guilt. "I chose building an empire over building relationships with my children. I gave you money instead of time, opportunities instead of attention. I don't blame you for not trusting my love. I never gave you reason to believe in it, but I did believe in it," Leo replied, his eyes filling with tears. "Even when you missed my art shows, even when you dismissed my career choices, even when you seemed more interested in Julian's legal career or Vanessa's social connections, I always believed that somewhere underneath all the business success, you still loved me." The confession hit Elliot like a revelation. While he'd been worried that his children only loved him for his money, Leo had been worried that his father didn't love him despite his lack of interest in money. They'd both been starving for the same authentic connection but approaching it from opposite directions. "I never stopped loving you," Elliot said, reaching out to grasp his son's hand with hands that no longer needed to shake with fake illness. "I just forgot how to show it. I got so caught up in providing for your future that I forgot to be present for your present." Leo squeezed his father's hand, and for the first time in decades, the gesture felt completely genuine. "Dad, I don't need you to provide for my future. I need you to be part of it. I don't want your money, I want your time. I don't need inheritance. I need relationship." Sitting in that chair, holding his youngest son's hand while rain continued to fall outside, Elliot finally understood what he'd been searching for through his elaborate deception. Leo had never needed testing because his love had never been conditional. While Julian and Vanessa had failed the test spectacularly, Leo had passed it simply by being himself. "Can you forgive me for the deception?" Elliot asked, his voice carrying the vulnerability of someone who had finally stopped hiding behind wealth and status. "Dad, Leo said with a smile that transformed his entire face. "I'm just grateful we get to have this conversation while you're still alive to hear it." For the first time in years, Elliot felt like he had found his sonar, perhaps. His son had finally found him. No one expected what Elliot would do next, but the family meeting he called for the following Sunday would become the most explosive confrontation in the Hargrove family's history. What happened when he revealed his final will would strip away every last pretense and expose his children's true characters in ways that would shock even him. The estate's grand library had been transformed into a formal meeting space, with Marcus Webb, the family attorney, positioned at the head of the mahogany table alongside notary witnesses and legal recording equipment. Elliot sat in his wheelchair, maintaining his frail facade, one last time, while Martha stood quietly in the corner, knowing she was about to witness the culmination of the most devastating family experiment ever conducted. Julian arrived early, his expensive suit and confident demeanor reflecting someone who expected to inherit control of a multi-billion-dollar empire. He'd brought his own attorney, a sharp-faced woman whose presence suggested he was prepared for complex legal discussions about corporate succession and tax optimization strategies. Vanessa swept in wearing designer black, as if she were already dressed for a funeral, her phone discreetly positioned to capture what she clearly expected would be emotional content for her social media platforms. She'd even arranged for her documentary crew to wait outside, ready to film her reaction to her father's final wishes. Leo entered last, his casual clothes and somber expression reflecting someone who was simply there to support his father through what he believed were genuinely final legal arrangements. Unlike his siblings, he hadn't brought legal representation or prepared for financial discussion. She was there out of love, not expectation. "Thank you all for coming," Elliot began, his voice carrying the manufactured weakness he'd perfected over the past month. "Given my deteriorating condition, I wanted to finalize my estate planning while I'm still mentally competent to make these decisions." Marcus Webb opened the official documents with practiced solemnity. "Your father has made some significant changes to his will," he announced, reflecting his wishes for how his estate should be distributed after his passing. Julian leaned forward eagerly, his eyes bright with anticipation. Vanessa adjusted her phone's angle to ensure she captured her emotional reaction to inheriting hundreds of millions of dollars. Only Leo seemed uncomfortable with the entire proceeding, shifting restlessly in his chair as if he wished he were anywhere else. "The first major provision," Marcus continued, "concerns the bulk of Mr. Hargrove's estate. 90% of his assets, including all stock holdings, real estate properties, and liquid investments, will be donated to the Hargrove Foundation for Educational Excellence and Community Development." The words hit Julian and Vanessa like physical blows. Julian's confident expression crumbled into shock and disbelief, while Vanessa's carefully composed social media face twisted into something resembling panic. "I'm sorry, what?" Julian stammered, his voice rising with indignation. 90% to charity? That can't be right." Marcus Webb continued with professional composure. "The remaining 10% of the estate will be placed in a family trust, to be divided equally among the 3 children. However, Leo Hargrove has been designated as the sole executor and trustee, with full discretionary power over all distributions." The explosion that followed was immediate and devastating. Julian shot to his feet, his face flushed with rage. "This is insane! Dad, you can't be serious about this. I'm the lawyer. I'm the one who understands business. Why would you put Leo in charge of anything?" Vanessa's reaction was equally volcanic. "Leo? The trust fund artist who's never worked a real day in his life? Daddy, this has to be the illness affecting your judgment. You can't possibly think he's qualified to manage family finances." The masks had finally come off completely. All pretense of loving concern for their dying father evaporated as Julian and Vanessa revealed the depth of their entitlement and greed. Their objections weren't about losing their father, they were about losing their inheritance. Furthermore, Marcus announced, raising his voice over their protests, Mr. Hargrove has included a specific provision stating that any attempt to legally challenge this will or contest his mental competency will result in the immediate forfeiture of all inheritance rights for the challenging party. Julian's attorney began frantically taking notes, clearly calculating legal strategies, while Julian himself paced the room like a caged animal. There has to be something we can do, he muttered. Undue influence. Diminished capacity, something. Vanessa turned on Leo with vicious intensity. This is your fault, isn't it? You manipulated him while he was vulnerable. You played the poor artistic son routine to get him to cut us out. But Leo's reaction was completely different from what his siblings expected. I don't want it, he said quietly, his voice cutting through their angry protests. I never wanted any of it. The simple statement silenced the room. Julian and Vanessa stared at their brother in disbelief, unable to comprehend someone rejecting what they so desperately coveted. Leo, Elliot said, speaking directly to his youngest son, the executor position comes with significant responsibilities. Are you certain you don't want that authority? Dad, I told you before I don't need your money to know that you love me, Leo replied, his voice steady and sincere. If you want to give 90% to charity, that's incredible. If you want to split the rest equally, that's fair. But I don't need to control anyone else's inheritance to feel valued by my father. Julian's mask of civilized behavior finally shattered completely. You self-righteous idiot, he screamed at Leo. Do you have any idea what you're throwing away? We're talking about billions of dollars and you're acting like it's pocket change. Maybe that's the difference between us, Leo replied calmly. You see dollar signs. I see our father trying to make sure his money does some good in the world after he's gone. Vanessa joined Julian's attack, her voice shrill with desperation. Easy for you to say when you've never had real responsibilities. Some of us have social obligations, charitable commitments, lifestyles to maintain. The irony was staggering. Vanessa was arguing that she needed inheritance money to fund her charitable activities, while simultaneously raging about their father donating to actual charity. This is exactly what I expected, Elliot said quietly, his voice carrying a sadness that finally penetrated their anger. Neither of you asked about my health, my pain, or how I'm feeling about facing death. Your first and only concern was money. The truth hung in the air like a toxic cloud, impossible to deny or defend against. Julian and Vanessa had revealed themselves completely, and there was no going back from what everyone in the room had witnessed. What happened next would determine whether this family could ever heal from the wounds that money had inflicted on their relationships. Right at that moment, Elliot knew he had to end the charade once and for all, but what he revealed next would shatter his family forever while simultaneously healing the one relationship that truly mattered. What happened when he finally stood up from that wheelchair would prove that sometimes the most powerful truth is the one that sets everyone free. Before you storm out and call your attorneys, Elliot said, his voice suddenly stronger than it had been in weeks, there's something else you need to know. Julian and Vanessa, who had been gathering their belongings in preparation for a dramatic exit, paused mid-motion. Something in their father's tone had shifted, carrying an authority that contradicted his supposed terminal condition. With deliberate slowness, Elliot gripped the arms of his wheelchair and stood up. The movement was steady, strong, and completely at odds with the frail, dying man he had been portraying for the past month. Julian's mouth fell open in shock, while Vanessa's phone clattered to the floor as she stared in disbelief. I'm not dying, Elliot announced, his voice now carrying the full power of someone in perfect health. There is no terminal illness. The entire diagnosis was fabricated to test how each of you would react when you thought my time was limited. The silence that followed was deafening. Julian's face cycled through confusion, realization, and then burning humiliation as he understood he'd been played. Vanessa's carefully crafted social media persona crumbled as she realized her grieving daughter performance had been based on a lie. You mean? Julian stammered, his legal mind struggling to process the implications. This was all fake? The illness? The will reading? Everything? The will reading was real, Elliot confirmed. Those are my actual wishes for my estate. What was fake was my motivation for making those decisions. I didn't change my will because I'm dying. I changed it because I discovered who you really are when you thought I was. Marcus Webb, who had been in on the deception from the beginning, produced a tablet and began playing audio recordings. Julian's voice filled the room, clear and devastating. Honestly, at this point, Dad's just a walking bank account with a deadline. Vanessa's face went white as her own recorded words followed. The whole dying billionaire thing is actually working out perfectly for my brand. The recordings continued, each one more damning than the last. Julian discussing selling off the company immediately after the funeral. Vanessa planning her grief recovery tour to Europe. Both siblings casually plotting to eliminate Leo from any inheritance considerations. These recordings, Elliot said, his voice heavy with disappointment, represent weeks of conversations you thought I couldn't hear. This is how you really feel about me, about each other, and about the wealth I've spent my life building. Julian's shock transformed into defensive anger. You had no right to spy on us. This whole thing was entrapment, manipulation. This whole thing was a mirror. Elliot interrupted. I didn't make you say those things. I didn't force you to see me as a walking bank account. I simply created a situation where you felt free to express your true feelings. Vanessa tried a different approach, her voice taking on the manipulative sweetness she'd perfected over decades. Daddy, you have to understand, we were grieving. People say things they don't mean when they're processing trauma. Trauma? Leo spoke up for the first time since the revelation, his voice filled with quiet disbelief. Vanessa, you booked a spa vacation and hired a documentary crew. That's not how people process grief. The truth was undeniable, and Julian and Vanessa both knew it. Their behavior over the past month had revealed character flaws so fundamental that no explanation could excuse them. I'm contesting this will, Julian declared, his voice shaking with rage and humiliation. This entire charade proves you're mentally unfit to make rational decisions about your estate. Good luck with that, Marcus Webb interjected smoothly. Mr. Hargrove has been under continuous medical and psychological evaluation throughout this entire period. We have extensive documentation proving his complete mental competency. Vanessa's final attempt at manipulation was desperate and pathetic. Daddy, please, you have to understand that we love you. We were just scared and confused. You love my money. Elliot replied with devastating simplicity. The recordings make that absolutely clear. Neither of you ever asked about my pain, my fears, or my emotional needs during what you believed were my final months. Your only concerns were financial. Julian and Vanessa exchanged glances, realizing that their decades of entitlement and greed had finally caught up with them. Without another word, they stormed out of the library, their footsteps echoing through the mansion as they left behind the inheritance they'd counted on and the father they'd never truly valued. Later that evening, as the estate settled into peaceful quiet, Elliot sat with Leo in the same library where the confrontation had occurred. The wheelchair had been returned to storage, the legal documents were filed, and the truth had finally set them all free. Do you regret it? Leo asked, referring to the devastating loss of his two siblings. Elliot considered the question carefully. I regret that it was necessary, he said finally, but I don't regret learning the truth. For the first time in decades, I know exactly where I stand with my children. Leo smiled sadly. And where's that? I lost two children who were never really mine, Elliot replied, but I found one son who always was. 6 months later, Leo stood in front of a gleaming new community center in downtown San Francisco, addressing a crowd gathered for the grand opening of the Hargrove Center for Youth Arts. The building, funded entirely through the charitable foundation that now controlled 90% of Elliot's wealth, would provide free art education and mentorship programs for underprivileged children. My father taught me that the true measure of wealth isn't what you accumulate. Leo said to the gathered crowd, but what you give back. This center represents his real legacy, not the money he made, but the lives he chose to touch. Elliot, standing proudly in the audience, finally understood what success actually looked like. It wasn't measured in billions of dollars or corporate empires. It was measured in the character of the people you raised and the positive impact you made on the world. He'd lost a fortune in inheritance, taxes, and legal fees, but he'd gained something infinitely more valuable, a genuine relationship with the one child who had loved him unconditionally all along. The test was over, and despite everything, he had won. What Elliot Hargrove discovered through his devastating experiment wasn't just about his children's greed, it was about the difference between conditional and unconditional love. As someone who's studied family dynamics, I can tell you that money doesn't create character flaws, it simply amplifies what was already there. The profound lesson here is that Elliot's fake death became real rebirth. He had to pretend to be dying to finally start living authentically with his son. Julian and Vanessa saw inheritance. Leo saw relationship. They counted dollars. He counted moments. Love doesn't need testing when it's genuine. Leo's consistent presence proved his heart without surveillance or hidden cameras. What moves me most is how many families are fractured by the same toxic belief that providing wealth substitutes for providing presence. Elliot built a fortune but nearly lost his family because he confused giving money with giving love. The most powerful transformation wasn't in the will reading, it was when father and son finally saw each other clearly, without the distortion of wealth or performance. The greatest inheritance isn't financial ease, it's relational. When we choose vulnerability over surveillance, trust over testing, we often discover that the love we've been searching for was there all along, waiting for us to be present enough to recognize it. If this story made you reflect on whether love in your family is conditional or unconditional, smash that like button and share your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe because we're exploring stories that reveal what it truly means to be human beyond material success. And hit that notification bell because the next tale of love overcoming greed will touch your soul even deeper.